Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Shadow of Kyoshi chapter analysis video. This one's going to be the chapter which is called Interlude Survival. So this is basically the follow-up chapter to the prologue of the book, and then there's also going to be another interlude later on in the book as well. And together, those three chapters are going to make up Yuan's backstory, catching us up from when he was taken away by Glowworm back in the first book in the chapter called The Spirit, all the way up until basically just before he goes after Jeonju at the end of the first book. So this will bring the story full circle, and it will explain what Kyoshi's been investigating all of this time. Has Yuan been possessed by a spirit or what? So where we ended the prologue, again it was a while ago within the book, a bunch of chapters have happened since, Glowworm was coming for him and he basically told Yuan, I am going to sort of consume you completely. So it's not a sort of spirit possession necessarily he's talking about. He is literally going to sort of consume Yuan to, increase his power, increase his strength. And he just talked about how, like, oh, you'll be sort of immortal because you'll be inside me. But the idea is that Yuan effectively would be gone if this happens. So we already know this isn't what happens. But something similar to it along those lines has to have happened, of course, just because of how powerful Yuan is as we see him. And clearly he has the sort of aura of Glowworm, the sort of rotting aspect to him. So what has actually happened? This chapter explains it basically all of it here, which is interesting. But it explains sort of the mechanics of what has happened to him, but it hasn't quite gone as far as the sort of character arc of what properly turns Yuan into the character that we've seen so far, willing to kill people. So Yuan throws his hands up to protect himself from Glowworm as Glowworm comes for him to consume him, and he thinks that this is just, to protect himself, but he just instinctively tries to bend, and it works. And I really like how the book does this. It's like the earth that always loved him when nothing else would. He should have known that even in his lowest moment, he would never be abandoned by his element, as he smashes, Father Glowworm back with some earth, and he just sort of stares at his hands and is like, I can bend here. Like, he's been in the spirit world for a little bit, but only now realizes that he can bend. So this has always been something he's been incredibly skilled at. He's a super talented earthbender. He sees hope now because while everyone else is gone, abandoned him, or betrayed him, the earth, which has always been so good to him, is still here. And then they cut, the fight towards the end. They basically just imply that it's gone on for quite a while. Monumental battle between talented earthbender and powerful spirit. The duel raged for 3 days and 3 nights is how this fable would have gone if told by another. In truth, he didn't know how long he battled Father Glowworm. So, it says here, time seemed to work differently here. At one point he remembered crawling on his hands and knees for the edge of the swamp, willing to put his lips to the bottom of the puddle, needing to drink more than he wanted to defend himself, but tendrils of slime had blocked his path, forcing him to turn and continue to fight. It was no longer about predator and prey, but whose hatred and stubbornness would see them through. And this is where they talk about how the two have sort of injured each other so far in the fight. Of course, with a spirit, there's no real sort of damaging body parts necessarily. When Yuan lands powerful earthbending blows against Glowworm, Glowworm shrinks. So this is the sort of Rabavatu dynamic that we've seen before, like when you damage a spirit, it sort of, it seemingly like blows a hole in them, but they sort of like merge back together, but smaller this time, highlighting that their energy has been sapped to a degree as you've sort of broken apart away from them, but they emerge, back in their full form, just smaller, of course. Yuan, on the other hand, is here with his physical body. So when he gets hit, he's taking actual damage, with the idea being that he has to be extremely cautious because, like, if he gets his legs broken, the fight is over. If he gets both of his arms too damaged, he can't bend as effectively. It's over. So he's taking sort of strategic damage over the course of the fight. He's very cautious about a couple of things. He says, like, a twisted elbow was better than a broken rib. Bleeding from the head was fine, but he had to protect his arteries. Above all, he could not lose consciousness, whether to exhaustion or a knockout blow. Just that he is still against the odds here against this spirit, because the spirits have sort of inherent advantages to a degree, just because their form is fluid to a degree, whereas that's not the case with humans, of course. But yeah, he said every time he struck home and truly wounded the spirit, it shrunk in size, a marker of progress. So they take a temporary break in the fight to sort of talk to each other. Ewan sort of back sort of to his normal self. How do I stack up against Karuk? I have it on good authority. I'm his equal when it comes to earthbending. Glowworm is annoyed by this and says, "You presumptuous little stain. If Avatar Kuruk hadn't weakened me all those years ago, I would have finished you in an instant." So while this is an incredibly powerful feat of bending from Yoon, they are clarifying to us here that Yoon is able to combat Glowworm as an equal here because of the damage previously done by Karuk, highlighting that an Avatar versus a full power spirit like Glowworm is a completely different level than Yoon as a very, very talented earthbender against Glowworm, who is still a powerful spirit. I like that sort of just sense of the scales of powers and how a spirit, just by being, I suppose, hurt a bunch of times, its power drops from being high level spirit to being sort of still notable spirit. So just interesting stuff overall. Glowworm realizes that, like, yes, you are being an inconvenience to me. You're more trouble than you're worth. There are easier meals to be had. Like, he always talks about this, meals, consuming people, with the idea seemingly being that, okay, if he's been so badly injured by Korok, is there any way for him to regain the power that he once had? And he seems to imply that if he just consumes humans, and I suppose consumes their spirit, that will increase the size power of his spirit as well. I think that's the dynamic that they're going for here. So he says, Glowworm says, "What do you say to a truce of sorts? I have a proposition for you." So Ewan is like, "Oh, I'm good at making deals. I'll listen to this. This will at least give me time to rest and come up with some sort of a plan." So Glowworm says, "I can grant you some of my power. You'd be able to create passage between the worlds of humans and spirits. In return, you would bring people to me. Not many. I don't want to become well known." So he's offering basically to do this sort of Tokuga style sort of spirit morphing thing, where he's basically saying, "I will pass through you and sort of imbue you with some of my power as I go through. And part of that power would be that, one, you'll get stronger, two, it might alter you physically, and three, you will also gain my special ability of being able to make holes in the fabric between the physical world and the spirit world." So this is how Yoon is potentially going to get back to the physical world, which we know he does, but how does this deal come about? So he asked a few questions, what does it take? How do you give me this power? Our forms would need to intertwine, but only briefly. It's a simple act, a physical one. You would possess me, pass through me. Call it whatever you wish, as long as we both let our guards down long enough to merge together. And he notes, you may see some changes to your physical nature, but it's no issue. If anything, you become stronger. And Ewan's kind of like, I don't really mind, my kind of good looks going away as such, but he knows that Father Glowworm probably isn't telling him the full story here. And he's like, okay, I accept this deal. And he's like, come closer. So they set the stage here. Glowworm sort of sockets himself between the trees again, implying that I suppose he's at his most powerful when he's still kind of connected to something or whatever. Because like he's an eye fundamentally. He's like a giant eye that has like obviously stuff that extends off of him. But fundamentally, like, I suppose an eye needs a socket, so to prepare the power to spirit morph someone, he needs to, socket himself between these trees. And so, as the spirit gets really close to Yoon, he acts, and obviously he was never going to properly agree to this deal. So what he does is he throws his hands apart, huge earthbending move, and just rips the ground apart beneath the tree that Glowworm had sort of socketed himself into. It says here, the entire floor of the grove followed them as he threw his hands apart. The ground layer containing the roots of the tree washed to the left and right, dividing right down the middle in a line that ran under Father Glowworm. The spirit suddenly had its clothing and protection stripped away by the tidal act of earthbending. It fell to a new level of ground Yoon created and howled in surprise. Yun nearly did the same. The brute force act had taken nearly every ounce of his power. Kyoshi could have done it easily, but the effort of washing away the topsoil had almost killed him. So I like the way there's just these subtle hints of sort of the power levels in a way between characters. Of Yun has only, I suppose, seen one act basically of Kyoshi bending, and that was what happened at the iceberg. So he knows Kyoshi is this big powerhouse bender, and despite how skilled and talented Yun is, at this stage he doesn't have that power level yet. The Yun we meet at the end of the last book, and so far in this book, does have that power level and sort of more. So something does happen with Glowworm, and I like that sense that something with Glowworm is going to happen that will enhance Yun's power, and we get it here over the next 2 pages. He caught Father Glowworm in the jaws of an earthen vice. Crushed in his stony grip, the spirit shrank further, and Glowworm is like shocked by this because he's basically been defeated here for good. Wretched boy, I offered you power and you resort to tricks. Not even Karuk would have disgraced himself in such a... As he's crushed even further. And he's like, shut up about Karuk. Stop. Without merging with me, you can't return to your home. I know. And then it says here, Yun reached out and plucked the shrunken eye from the rock. It was wet and sticky like a sea prune too. It's just going to be on my terms, not yours. What are you doing, Father Glowworm? Shrieked in his fingers, no less loud for its diminished size. Exactly what you were going to do to me. Without giving it any further consideration, Yun popped the eyeball into his mouth. And then, last paragraph here. The sphere burst between his teeth. The bitter taste of the jelly inside washed over his tongue, and a scream ran through his limbs, vibrating his bones like the stings of an eru. The sickly clouds overhead fled for the cover of the horizon. He could feel the trees hiding their faces in shame. He didn't need to be told by an older, wiser master to understand. Combining with an immortal being in such a sacrilegious way created a permanent hole in the weave. It was a crime against order, an abhorrent violation of spiritual balance. Yun swallowed his mouthful and let change overcome him. He'd never been a picky eater. So, we started this chapter with the idea that, Glowworm is going to consume Yun. But we end the chapter with Yun having defeated and consuming Glowworm. So it's a very interesting one to discuss, I suppose, what exactly happens here effectively. In that there's a bunch of different methods of like spirit sort of morphing or possession or whatever way you want to talk about it. But they don't do the sort of typical ones. Already, the whole idea of Glowworm consuming Yun to sort of restore his power. Okay, that sort of makes sense. He consumes the soul of a human to increase the power of his own soul/spirit. This is like the reverse of that, where he shrinks Glowworm down to a size where Yun can consume him, and then does so. They cover, like at the end of the chapter, that he does gain power. He could feel a change coming over him, which I suppose explains to us this sort of like a rotten aura that surrounds Yun every time someone sees him. And also how he is able to then get back to the physical world. The deal that Glowworm offered him here was that if you let me pass through you, I'll like willingly give you a bit of my power. You will have the ability to form a hole between the worlds to go back. But he seems to get that in this deal as well. So I suppose the question is like, what exactly is happening here? And I think it's probably actually the best comparison to this is probably Juan and Rava before they merge, bonded forever at harmonic convergence. In that case, what was happening was that Rava would always pass through Juan. And the goal of that was obviously that would switch elements. That's how Juan would switch from firebending to waterbending or earthbending or whatever, because he could only bend one element at a time before they merged properly together. The other thing that is said in dialogue there that's actually a very important point that not a lot of people pick up on is that he says, I feel myself growing stronger every time you pass through me. So the amount of energy Juan can contain in his body is increasing every time that happens, to the point where he's actually able to hold Rava in him fully for at least a certain amount of time, the sort of proto-avatar state we see, And even the fact that he's able to do that speaks like volumes. That with Rava, there's no physical alteration just because Rava is literally just light. So the only change that can overcome one is internally, like the energy within his body. Here it's obviously different in that they seem to imply there's whoever controls the merging has control over sort of the results. So if Glowworm had control, he would have probably morphed Yoon to look more like him. And we probably would have seen some weird stuff happen of like him having the sort of like teeth arm, the kind of jelly arm with the teeth sticking out of it and stuff like that. He would look somewhat like Glowworm. But because Yoon defeated Glowworm and shrunk him down to a manageable size, I suppose this is how effectively Yoon is able to stay merged to a degree and in control of Glowworm while Glowworm is in his body. That the reason Yoon is not being ripped apart by the power of a spirit here is because he's defeated the spirit so much that he's getting the core of his powers without the full just like energy to sort of tear apart. It's definitely an interesting one to interpret, in that I doubt anytime soon we'll hear about any more examples of like this form of a spirit and human sort of merging together. But like the question I'd have is kind of like, okay, spirits can't ever truly be destroyed, except maybe with the dark version of the spirit bending technique, sort of is implied to literally destroy a spirit. So spirits, when they are properly destroyed, are just reborn in a new form. So Yoon eating Glowworm, does he technically kill/destroy Glowworm? Or is Glowworm still alive within him, just sort of as part of like Yoon's spirit now, which is why Yoon is able to bore between worlds, and it's also why Yoon has such an increased sort of power level basically as we go forward. And we've already seen with the ripping the earth out of the paint and stuff like that. I think they get across the idea that perhaps isn't something he'd be able to do on the same scale that he does it at if he wasn't merged with the spirit in some way. And especially later on in the final fight within the book, we'll really see the scope of Yoon's abilities at this point. I like it. I like that there's enough detail here, but there's also a lot of room for speculation about it, because they do say it, he let the change overcome him, and he can tell that this from the spirit world that like this is not the way it's like typically like meant to be done. Him just dominating a spirit like this. And I think it's such a cool twist as well, that this is more or less what confirms to us of like, no, he dominated Father Glowworm to the point where Glowworm doesn't have an influence over him. Okay, Yoon has extra power now, but it's like Yoon is doing what Yoon wants to do, and it's all about the next interlude. The next interlude to explain to us, okay, this explains how he survives, how he's able to come back. Now explain more of the character piece. How does Yoon go from being like, okay, Yoon who's defeated the spirit, to let me take revenge against this list of people and kill whoever I need to along the way. That's what the next interlude is about. But we'll get there. So yeah, really solid chapter. I like the references to like Glowworm shrinking in size as he's defeated, Yoon using his sort of assassination training to like be picky about like, oh, I'll take an injury here to avoid an injury here. That feels very sort of technical. Like that's the sort of thing that he'd learn in a fight to the death of like how do you last the longest in a fight. Very interesting stuff overall. And then yeah, just the fact that they go somewhat in depth into the idea of a spirit, offering their abilities to someone, and it can be used in this case as like, I will give you the boon of my power, or it can be used as more of a punishment, like what happens to sort of Tokuga, where the dragon eel spirit thing just passes through him and alters him as a punishment, but it leaves behind some power as well. Yet there's other examples like Yao, where he seems to just get physically spirit morphed without any example of like a power being granted to him, just a weakness. But yeah, really, really good chapter. A big turn of events of, okay, he gets spirit morphed or something like that, but no, he eats Glowworm. He consumes Glowworm and takes him into himself that way. Very interesting stuff. So there are my thoughts on this chapter. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.